From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
Major League Baseball is concerned about the lack of balls hit in play.
The idea is to limit how much velocity is taken over the game, limit how much the upper reaches of the strike zone can be reached.
How fast the ball came off the bat, how much it's spinning, the launch angle, all that are all directly measured these days.
If you want the ball to play the same in April that you do in August, that's the idea behind the humidor.
All things equal, a lighter ball does not carry as well as a heavy ball.
I'm Sarah Fensky.
Oh, he's going to just keep getting...
Carlson hits it into deep right and his second home run. Dylan Carlson, home run number 18.
Now, before the Cardinals' current hot streak, and boy, is it a hot streak, there was a lot of talk about what was going wrong. And one of the big areas of focus was the Cardinals' offense, but pretty much only during home games. Unusually for Major League Baseball teams, the Cardinals were winning more on the road, and they were also hitting better there. That made some people wonder, could Busch Stadium be a factor? Now the Cardinals recently won 17 in a row, and it's interesting to note 11 of those 17 wins happened on the road. Now, lead Cardinals beat writer Derek Gould recently aired speculation about Busch Stadium's effect on the Cardinals offense in a fascinating story in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and he joins us today. Derek, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, it's great to hear your voice. And so I know there's been a lot going on with the Cardinals lately. They have been on a tear. Has this recent winning streak quelled some of the talk about the Busch Stadium problems when it comes to hitters?
I don't know about quelled some of the talk. It's still an internal discussion. It's still an internal discussion going on with the team because they have this wealth of information, this wealth of data that they're pulling on over the last few years, and this dramatic change. And they can't help but tie it to kind of the construction around it.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting, even in this last winning streak where they were doing so well, a lot of these wins were on the road. This doesn't necessarily contradict some of these concerns.
No, you're right. I mean, and also, it kind of feeds into it, right? We have a great example yesterday where Paul DeJong hits that ball that's a double, right? Big point in the game. He really got a lot of it. And then you have, it fall flat, right? Fall on the track. And in 15 out of 30 ballparks, that's a home run. And then Dylan Carlson comes up and hits a ball that, is just that much harder, just that much lower, and really has to sting it to get it out to that same spot.
So this is really something that hitters are feeling as they're out there trying to do their jobs.
Yeah, opposing teams are talking about it. Other players talk about it. I mean, in batting practice, they talk about it. Outfielders wonder about it as they're playing out there, and they notice the wind and the direction it's going.
Well, we're joined today by a second guest, somebody who might have some insight into where speculation might meet the reality of physics, and that is Alan Nathan. He's a professor emeritus of physics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's also an expert in the physics of baseball. So, Alan, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
So, Alan, we've been talking about how the Cardinals Stadium might be suppressing the offense there. Do you think it's fair to say ballpark design can make or break a team?
Well, I'm not sure I would say it would make or break a team, but certainly it could make or break whether a fly ball goes for a home run or not. It all has to do with where the fences are located, the temperature in the ballpark, things like that. But it also has a lot to do with wind, and wind is very hard to know a lot about because it's sensitive to what kinds of constructions are nearby, what kind of wind tunnel effects there might be. And I suspect, although I don't know, that might be what's going on at Busch Stadium.
So, Derek, this is something that you raised in this very interesting article you had in the Post-Dispatch, that the construction of Ballpark Village may have done something to change the wind patterns here. That went up last summer. Is that right, that final or that second phase opened?
Right, yeah, the Cardinal Way, Cardinal Way, One Cardinal Way. That's the name of the skyscraper that's out there. So this is really like the first full season that they have with that there, but it's not the first full season that they've had like a lot of construction there and the change in kind of that opening that they once had between, the left and right field stands, that wide open spot, the Ford Plaza, looking out towards the courthouse. But, over the last few years, there have been increasing construction there. And then, of course, the high rise that now is impossible to miss at One Cardinal Way.
Yeah, it makes for a really nice skyline that you can see when you're sitting behind home plate. But, Ellen, it sounds like you're saying this could really have changed the wind patterns within this ballpark.
Yeah, it's quite conceivable. So, as Derek said, there's a lot of data that we have that can be used to study what ball players would call the carry of a fly ball, meaning for given initial conditions, how fast the ball came off the bat, how much it's spinning, the launch angle, all that are all directly measured these days. And the distance of a fly ball is measured. And one could easily look, and I suspect the Cardinal analysts have done such. I have not personally done this kind of analysis. But you could ask the question, is the ball carrying different for given initial conditions? Is it carrying worse now than it did last year? Because we had the data last year also. We had the data over quite a few years. Is it traveling worse than it does at other stadiums after correcting for the obvious kinds of things that you could easily correct for, such as temperature and elevation, maybe humidity, which is not a big effect. So, there's a lot of information out there, and the one piece of information that is most difficult to take into account is the wind, because think of it, you're in the ballpark, you're in the stands, and you look at the flags overhead, and you see the wind blowing in one direction out there in left field, that behind home plate is blowing in a different direction. And so the wind changes both in space and in time, and it's very, very hard to take that into account.
Derek, hearing Alan talk about these various things that I know that, the whole sabermetrics crew is now analyzing all this stuff when it comes to baseball, are the Cardinals as an organization drilling down to this level that he's talking about here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they are. That's part of the idea. When they first built Busch Stadium, they did what was called a wind study, and you build up a model of the kind of landscape and the ballpark and where it would be, and they did that. They're looking at other modeling options, from what I've been told, as to how to take a look at how the skyscraper has changed things. The baseball data tells them what's happened. Mm-hmm. These modelings and the questions that you guys are asking tell them why it's happening, and they know what's happening. They can put really good numbers on that and see how just slugging and doubles and some home runs, certainly opposite field home runs, have vanished. How the game at Busch Stadium is different than it is elsewhere in the league, especially in the division. And they've worked on, okay, now they know what, so now they need to find out why, so that they can then answer how to change that. And also the question is if, at some point they have to ask if they want to change this and if that's what fans want to see. Is it a more entertaining game that they could provide by altering the ballpark?
Yeah, when you talk about altering the ballpark, obviously they're not going to tear down One Cardinal Way. The skyscraper is going to stay. But there's other ways that ballparks have been changed throughout the years. Alan, is there something you'd point to as here's a change that actually paid some dividends for a team?
Oh, I think a few years ago the Angels lowered the fence height in right field, and that had a predictable effect on home runs. So that's certainly one thing one could do. One could move the fences in closer. Maybe that's a little harder to do, I don't know. But lowering the fences is certainly one thing that could be done.
So we're not looking at things that are necessarily real high-tech solutions here. This is like baseball 101. Like, we could just move this in 10 feet. We get a lot more home runs.
Right, of course, absolutely.
So one other factor that's been talked about here, and that you raised in your really interesting story about this, Derek, is this humidor, which apparently is in use for the first time this season. Tell us about what a humidor does in a Major League Baseball stadium.
So this is something that Colorado has used and Arizona has used and some other teams this year expanded to using. And when you think about like a humidor, right, just for cigars or anything like that, you're trying to modulate the atmosphere in which something is stored. Mm-hmm. You're trying to control the atmosphere. And it's interesting because the atmosphere at Coors Field, the humidor there, was set towards Missouri atmosphere because that's where the balls have been stored for so long. When you think about that, okay, so that's Rawlings, right? The balls are made by Rawlings, St. Louis-based company. The balls are stored before being shipped out to the ballparks here in Missouri, not too far from Washington, Missouri. And so Colorado calibrated the humidor to store balls there kind of at a natural resting condition to control what was going on, a mile above sea level. Similarly in Arizona, to control what was happening in that dry desert heat. Well, the Cardinals put a humidor in thinking, look, if you can do that at those levels, then why not try to see if you can keep the baseball the same for the entirety of a season, not with the fluctuations of the season as the heat goes up, as humidity rises.
So they're using this, they're inserting some humidity into the St. Louis environment in the rare times when we don't already have enough humidity.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, if you want the ball to play the same in April that you do in August, that's the idea behind the humidor, right? Like you say, okay, let's not just for a geographic region, but let's set it for a time of year and a meteorological position.
So, Alan, does that make sense to you? The idea of trying to climate control these balls, could that be a factor in what's going on here?
It could be, but I doubt that it is. And let me explain. The primary effect of the humidor is to change what is technically called the coefficient of restitution, which is another name for the bounciness of the ball. When the ball is stored at higher humidity, the ball is less bouncy and simply can't be hit as hard. And likewise, at low humidity, it can be hit harder because it's got a greater bounciness factor to it. And that's the primary effect. But the analyses that presumably have been done are looking at how far that ball carries for a given exit velocity off the bat. So that already factors in the humidity, the humidor factor, the primary effect of the humidor. So there is a secondary effect, which is it's possible that it comes into play here. So let me explain that.
That'd be great.
When the ball absorbs water, it also gets heavier. When you dry out the ball, it's lighter. All things equal, a lighter ball does not carry as well as a heavy ball. There's more air drag on it, or the effect of air drag is greater. But that's sort of a secondary effect. It's not the primary effect of the humidor. So while it is true that the humidor could be playing a role, somehow I'm suspicious that it is.
We're talking today about the interplay between baseball stadiums and good play with two expert guests. That's the lead Cardinals beat writer at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Derek Gould, and Alan Nathan, a professor emeritus of physics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We do need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
And now back to our conversation. We're talking today to Alan Nathan. He's a professor emeritus of physics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We're also joined by Derek Gould. He's the lead Cardinals beat writer at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And we want to hear from you. Do you remember a stadium ever being a big factor in a team's success or even an individual player's success? Help us revisit that. We're at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. You can also send us a tweet at STL on air. Now, Derek, you had a great quote in your story exploring these issues. This is from the Cardinals' Nolan Arenado. He said, arguably, I go from one of the top 3 greatest hitters ballparks to the top 3 worst, numbers-wise, ballparks for hitters. Can this make a big impact on an individual player's success?
Absolutely, yeah. It can change, what looks like, an MVP season with big round numbers, 40 homers, 100 RBIs, big slugging percentage, big OPS, and it can change it into something that is different than that because, it's suppressed a little bit. This is always kind of the case, Yankee Stadium, new and old, favored certain kind of hitters. That big green monster in Boston, we all know how some hitters have taken advantage of that. So there's always a ballpark factor, which is why more and more you hear them talk about ballpark factors as a number that they can use to normalize stats and get to know more about hitters. I mean, we all know, as Hall of Fame voters, people wrestle with what to do with, say, Coors Field. And, Larry Walker getting in this year was a big deal because that's a stride forward that probably indicates a real understanding of what Todd Helton will do, for example, and his Hall of Fame credentials, even though he played so many of his games at Coors Field.
Yeah, and Larry Walker, this was a great example of a player who was pretty good, but moving to Denver ended up really kicking things into overdrive. Are you worried that for the Cardinals, there's going to be good players who go, all other things being equal, I might not want to move to St. Louis because this is not going to help me in my next contract negotiations?
Well, the other side of that is that pitchers would love to be here, right?
There you go.
You have the two disciplines, right, in baseball. So you have to have hitters who are, aware of it and kind of it is a test, right? Because they're not going to see the same ballooned numbers that they would elsewhere. They're not going to get the immediate results. They're not going to get the numerical affirmation that their approach is right. So it probably does take hitters of a stronger stock a little bit to be aware of that. And it also takes coaches and a manager willing to do that.
And Derek, so is there kind of a pitcher's lobby that is speaking up occasionally here as these debates go forward, like, oh no, like things are okay the way they are?
Wait, sorry, what was that?
I
missed it.
Is there somebody lobbying now on behalf of pitchers saying, I actually like Busch Stadium just fine, let's not change anything?
I think, I think there's probably some of that joy, but it's mostly kidding because it's gone to such an extreme, right? Mm-hmm. The Busch Stadium was when it opened a pitcher-friendly park, and that was by design. I mean, they like a style of baseball. The Cardinals fans do. The Cardinals do. They're a run prevention team when they've been at their best over the last 15, 20 years here. They've had great lineups and a lot of great names in there: Albert Pujols, Scott Rowland, Jim Edmonds, now Nolan Arenado, and Paul Goldschmidt. In the middle there, they had Matt Holliday and Carlos Beltran. But they are a run prevention team, and that, is somewhat, that traces its way back to what they call the Cardinal way and fundamental principles of playing defense. They would like to suffocate teams with their defense if possible. And they had a ballpark that catered to that. It was a pitcher-friendly ballpark. It made the most of any pitching staff, and they've been very good at developing pitching. What's happened now is it's skewed to an extreme where the benefit the pitchers are getting, mm-hmm. especially in the modern game, may not outweigh how much it's suppressed the hitters. And that, to the question that we've kind of been talking about, they have to find that spot, that sweet spot, where it's still a pitcher-friendly park, which is what they want, but it's not one that reduces their offense to a point that it negates any benefit the pitchers get.
That makes sense. And Alan, I know in the past you've been somewhat skeptical of how teams have made some changes. Does it feel like the Cardinals have hit this critical mass where this is maybe one where they are going to need to make some changes to the stadium?
Oh, it's quite possible. I mean, I think one classic example is Yankee Stadium in New York. So the new Yankee Stadium first came into play, I think, during the 2009 season. And early in that season, there were a tremendous number of home runs being hit, especially to right field. Well, right field is, in baseball lingo, a short porch in Yankee Stadium. So, and the Yankees very effectively had a lot of power-hitting left-handed hitters to take advantage of that short porch. And I think that more than anything accounted for that big increase in home runs. similarly, the Yankees at the trade deadline this year, prior to the trade deadline, there's only one left-handed batter in the starting lineup, and they acquired two power-hitting sluggers, Gallo and Rizzo, again to take advantage of what basically their stadium is giving them. So I think teams understand these things very well. They have a lot of analytical tools at their disposal to be able to shape the team so that to take advantage of half the games that they play, in their home stadium.
We got a question from Twitter. Bruce asks, are they going to raise or lower the pitcher's mound? And how much does that affect the physics of baseball? I'm going to start with Alan on that. Does that have a big impact on the physics of baseball to mess with the mound?
Oh, I think it would, and I'm skeptical that it's going to happen. It might happen. So they did experiment in the minor leagues, in one of the minor leagues this year with something slightly different, moving the mound back a foot. Again, the idea, I think what baseball is, Major League Baseball is concerned about these days is the lack of balls hit in play. So the game is dominated by strikeouts and home runs, and maybe to a lesser extent walks. But in all three of those cases, the fielders have no opportunity to field the ball. And one of the things that Major League Baseball is trying to do is alter the game not in serious way, but in maybe small, subtle ways, so that there are more balls in play. So it's not a sort of a all or nothing kind of thing, home run or strikeout.
I mean, for a fan, it's just a lot more interesting to see the ball in play. I imagine this could affect attendance if people are just striking out right and left. Derek, has there been talk about doing anything with the mound in this current situation we're dealing with?
So they're experimenting with moving the mound back in one of the independent leagues. Major League Baseball has an agreement with the Atlantic League to allow for some experiments. That's where you've seen things about reducing how teams played or changing how teams play defense and limiting the shift or widening the base just a little bit so that steals have a higher chance of happening, right? Like if you make a bigger base, that slide gets there that much quicker. And does that change the game? Moving the mound back is something that former Cubs president Theo Epstein has talked about, and they implemented there. It's really not showing how much of a change there's been. There's not really there's not a whole lot of data just yet on it, but also it's pretty inconclusive. There is concern as to say what that might do for injuries, because you're asking the pitcher to throw that much farther, that much at the same kind of exertion. But the idea is to limit how much velocity is taken over the game, limit how much the upper reaches of the strike zone can be reached, all of those things.
We also had a question from Twitter for Professor Nathan. Is it possible for a batter to hit the ball harder or farther if their grip connection is optimized? For example, Tyler O'Neill switching to a new bat knob this season. Any thoughts on whether that can have an impact?
Oh, I've written many articles about this very subject.
Wow.
Yes. It's not likely to have any effect whatsoever on how hard the ball could be hit. And there are some subtle points of physics there, but the knob plays virtually no role whatsoever in the ability to hit the ball hard. But there is one exception to that, which is there is this type of bat which is called the axe bat, A-X-E, where the knob is sort of built like an axe handle. That has to do largely with, I think, preventing injuries to batters in their wrist as they swing the bat. I don't think I have seen absolutely no data that suggests that you can hit the ball harder with the axe bat, and it would be astonishing if it did, but it might help prevent hamate type of injuries.
Alan, hearing you talk about this stuff with the level of detail that you have, I have to wonder, is this a trend now where baseball teams are picking up physicists to put them on retainer and just have them whittle away at inches? Do you see colleagues getting recruited for this sort of thing?
Yes, I do, actually. In fact, a former undergraduate student of mine who graduated a year ago was immediately hired by the Houston Astros and is part of their R&D and analytics department. And I've had personally quite good success getting students of mine involved in Major League Baseball. Yes, I do think it's a trend, and I think, of course, I think it's a good trend. I think physicists do have a lot to offer, and I think Major League teams over the years are learning that.
Boy, it sure does seem like it. They're going down that path. Derek, talking about all of this and talking about teams even moving the mound backwards, I have to say I'm a little surprised that a team is just allowed to do that. I always assumed that was enshrined in the baseball rule book. Things like changing stadiums and changing mounds. Do teams have to get approval from some governing body before they can do this stuff?
Well, moving the mound would be league-wide. Any change to the actual competition within, like, the bounds of the limits of the ballpark would be league-wide. They wouldn't change, like, the third baseline to be Lombard Street in San Francisco and change it to be, Market Street in St. Louis. They would do that league-wide. So, but the ballparks themselves, part of the light, the joy, the whimsy of baseball is the different ballparks. That stems, of course, from, them being put into neighborhoods like Wrigley Field, or, you think back to some of the older ballparks like Ebbets Field. This is the land that they have within this neighborhood, within this city, the Polo Grounds. This is where the ballpark's going to be. Just make sure it faces one direction and then see what the boundaries bring, Houston is a current example of that, where the Crawford boxes are created by the footprint that they had to make the downtown ballpark. Busch Stadium, to an extent, is created by the boundaries of the city around it, and overlaps with the old Busch Stadium. So that's what creates the, this notion of how a ballpark walls are done, and those can be changed. I mean, they'll talk to Major League Baseball, but in the end, the ballpark is owned by the owners of the ballpark and often the owners of the team, and that's where that change would take place. Many ballparks have done this. The Mets with Citi Field, their current ballpark, have done it twice, where they've moved the walls in.
So definitely some precedent here. Well, Derek Gould, you've been so great about joining us, even on a day when there's all sorts of news breaking. I got to ask you one last question since we have you on the phone today. Is this a team that can go all the way at this point?
Wow, that's a good question. They're going to be in the hardest bracket, however this turns out. They're going to have two 100-win teams in their way, two of the titans of the season. They need to be at their best, and we've seen them at their best over this last 22-game stretch. They've won 17 in a row. I think there's a question as to, where that pitching is. Now, if they can get Dakota Hudson, as vintage Dakota Hudson, that's a real X factor for them, and could really help them in a long series, in that best-of-5 series against a 100-win team. It's whether or not they can get past. At the moment, it would be Max Scherzer. And St. Louis is very, very familiar with how good Max Scherzer pitches against the Cardinals. So they'll need to be at their best. They can find a way past it because anything can happen in one game. And then they might be set up pretty well to go from there. It's the biggest test is that one game.
Well, I'm feeling some hope here, so I'm just going to cross my fingers. Derek Gould, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Derek, again, is the lead Cardinals beat writer at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. His story that kind of launched this whole idea that we're talking about today, we have that linked on our website, stlonair.show. Encourage people to check that out for themselves or find it at stltoday.com. Alan Nathan, I have one last question before I'm going to let you go. Say that the Cardinals hired you as a consultant for this big problem they're dealing with. What would be your first piece of advice as they're grappling with just the low offense in this stadium?
Oh, I would simply try to get a handle on exactly what the problem is by just trying to analyze the voluminous amount of data that we have. On the other hand, I know some of the people in the Cardinal organization, and I suspect they've done that already. So I'm not sure I could be of much value to them, but maybe.
Maybe. Well, we'll see if your phone starts ringing after this segment. We apologize for that.
Not a problem.
Alan Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
This episode was produced by Jane Mather Glass, with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr and production assistance by Jane. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.